The sun hung low over the rugged landscape of Wyoming Territory in 1882, casting long shadows across the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge. Eli Thompson, a 13-year-old boy with sun-weathered skin and clothes patched more times than anyone could count, sat on the steps of the general store, watching the last customers of the day hurry home before nightfall. 3 months had passed since cholera had taken his parents, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that had little patience for orphaned children. The townspeople tolerated him. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house let him sleep in her barn in exchange for mucking stalls, and Mr. Garrett occasionally gave him a penny for sweeping the store. But Eli knew he was living on borrowed time and charity that could run dry at any moment. The evening air carried the usual sounds of the frontier settlement: creaking wagon wheels, distant laughter from the saloon, and the gentle lowing of cattle being driven to pasture. But tonight, there was something else. A plaintive bleating that seemed to come from the pine forest that bordered the small Shoshone village about a mile east of town. Eli had always been curious about the native settlement. The Shoshone people who lived there maintained an uneasy peace with Cedar Ridge, trading furs and crafted goods for supplies, but the two communities remained largely separate. Most townspeople viewed the natives with suspicion, and the feeling was mutual after years of broken promises and land disputes. The crying sound grew more insistent, clearly coming from a distressed animal. Eli's heart went out to whatever creature was in trouble. He knew too well what it felt like to be alone and afraid. Against his better judgment, he stood up and began walking toward the forest, following the sound. The tall pines seemed to swallow him as he entered the woods, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the fading daylight. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen needles that muffled his footsteps, and the air was thick with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. "Here, little one," Eli called softly, moving carefully through the underbrush. "Where are you?" The bleating grew louder, and soon he spotted the source, a small lamb, its white wool dirty and tangled with burrs, trapped between two fallen logs. Its mother was nowhere to be seen, and the little creature was clearly exhausted from crying and struggling. "Easy now," Eli whispered, approaching slowly. The lamb looked up at him with frightened eyes but seemed to sense he meant no harm. Carefully, Eli moved one of the smaller logs and lifted the lamb free, checking it for injuries. Apart from some scratches and fatigue, the animal seemed unharmed. As he cradled the lamb, Eli noticed something unusual about the area where it had been trapped. The fallen logs weren't randomly placed. They seemed to have been arranged deliberately, and beneath them, partially hidden by decades of leaf litter and moss, were what looked like carved stones. His curiosity overwhelming his caution, Eli gently set the lamb down and began clearing away the debris. What he uncovered made him catch his breath. The stones weren't just carved, they were expertly crafted with intricate designs that told a story. Eli had learned to read from his mother, and while these symbols were unfamiliar, he could sense they held deep meaning. The largest stone appeared to be a marker of some kind, with what looked like a map or diagram etched into its surface. As he continued to clear the area, more artifacts emerged from their hiding place: pottery shards, tools made from bone and stone, and what appeared to be a leather bundle wrapped in multiple layers of hide to protect it from the elements. The lamb, now recovered from its ordeal, wandered nearby, occasionally bleating as if encouraging Eli to continue his exploration. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he carefully unwrapped the leather bundle. Inside, he found several items that made his heart race. Detailed drawings on specially treated hide, showing the layout of the surrounding area from generations past, and what appeared to be a written record in both Shoshone symbols and broken English. One passage, written in faded ink, caught his attention. "For the children who come after, the sacred places of our fathers, hidden when the soldiers came. 1864. Chief Running Bear." Eli's mind raced as he realized what he had stumbled upon. This wasn't just a random collection of artifacts. This was a historical record, a time capsule left by someone who wanted future generations to remember. The year 1864 resonated in his memory. He recalled stories of conflicts between settlers and native tribes, times when many indigenous communities had been forced to hide their most precious possessions to keep them safe. The detailed maps showed not just the current landscape, but locations of historical significance to the Shoshone people. Burial grounds, ceremonial sites, and places where important events had occurred. There were also records of treaties, trade agreements, and even genealogical information about tribal families. As darkness began to fall, Eli carefully rewrapped the artifacts and gathered them up, along with the lamb. He knew he had found something incredibly important, but he also understood the weight of responsibility that came with this discovery. These items didn't belong to him. They belonged to the Shoshone people, and they deserved to be returned to their rightful owners. The walk back through the darkening forest felt different now. Eli carried not just a lost lamb, but the preserved history of an entire people. His mind churned with questions. How should he approach the Shoshone village? Would they trust him? What would this mean for the relationship between the two communities? As he emerged from the forest, the lights of both Cedar Ridge and the Shoshone settlement twinkled in the distance. For the first time in months, Eli felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, and Eli made his decision. After returning the lamb to a grateful farmer on the outskirts of town, who rewarded him with a hearty breakfast and a silver dollar, he carefully gathered the artifacts and began the walk toward the Shoshone settlement. His heart pounded as he approached the village. Several people stopped their morning activities to watch the white boy walking deliberately toward their community, carrying what appeared to be a significant bundle. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, and men straightened from their work, their expressions wary but curious. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger lodges, her grey hair braided with beads and her weathered face displaying the wisdom of many years. She spoke in Shoshone to a younger man beside her, who stepped forward as a translator. "I am Joseph Crow Feather," the man said in clear English. "My grandmother, Singing Bird, asks what brings you to our village, young one." Eli took a deep breath, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "My name is Eli Thompson. I found something in the forest that I believe belongs to your people. Something very important." Joseph translated for his grandmother, whose eyes sharpened with interest. She gestured for Eli to come closer, and soon a small crowd had gathered around them. Among them was a distinguished man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of a leader, Chief White Eagle, as Joseph quietly identified him. With trembling hands, Eli unwrapped the artifacts and began to explain how he had found them while rescuing a lost lamb. As the Shoshone people saw the carved stones and the leather bundle, murmurs of amazement rippled through the crowd. Singing Bird gasped and spoke rapidly to her grandson, pointing at one of the hide drawings. Joseph's eyes widened as he translated. "She says, these are the hidden records of Chief Running Bear, her grandfather. They were buried during the troubles of 1864 when the army came through and many families had to flee quickly." Chief White Eagle knelt down to examine the artifacts more closely, his usually stoic expression showing deep emotion. He spoke in Shoshone, his voice thick with feeling, and Joseph translated, "He says these contain the locations of our sacred places, the genealogies of our families, and the true accounts of treaties that were made and broken. We thought they were lost forever." As more people gathered, Eli watched in awe as warriors, elders, and families began to recognize specific items and documents. There were tears in many eyes as they pointed to names of ancestors, familiar landmarks, and records of their heritage that had been preserved against all odds. But the most significant moment came when Chief White Eagle stood and placed his hands on Eli's shoulders. Speaking in English so the boy would understand, he said, "You could have sold these to collectors for much money. You could have kept them as curiosities. Instead, you brought them home to us. This shows a heart that honors what is right over what is profitable." The chief then did something that stunned everyone present, including his own people. He slowly knelt before Eli, not in submission, but in a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. Following his lead, the other tribal members, warriors, elders, mothers with children, also knelt, acknowledging not just Eli's actions, but the bridge he had helped build between two communities that had lived in mistrust for too long. Word of Eli's discovery and the tribe's response spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. Some townspeople were skeptical, others were curious, but many were moved by the story of the orphaned boy who had done the right thing when no one was watching. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, was among the first to seek Eli out after hearing the news. "You've shown more character in one day than most people show in a lifetime," she told him, her usually stern expression softened by genuine admiration. "That barn of mine is getting awfully lonely. How would you feel about a real bed in the house instead?" But the most significant changes were happening between the two communities. Chief White Eagle and several town leaders, including Mayor Crawford, began meeting regularly to discuss trade agreements, shared resources, and mutual assistance. The historical documents Eli had found actually contained records of successful cooperation between settlers and the Shoshone in earlier times, providing a blueprint for peaceful coexistence. Joseph Crow Feather became a regular visitor to Cedar Ridge, serving as a cultural liaison and teacher. He began giving informal lessons about Shoshone history and customs to anyone interested, helping to dispel myths and misconceptions that had fueled mistrust for years. 3 months after his discovery, Eli found himself in an unprecedented position. Both communities had come to see him as a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over suspicion, when they acted with integrity rather than self-interest. The artifacts were eventually housed in a special building constructed jointly by both communities, half in Cedar Ridge and half in the Shoshone village, connected by a covered walkway that symbolized the bridge between the two cultures. Eli was appointed as the official caretaker, a position that came with a small salary and, more importantly, a sense of belonging he had never known. On a crisp autumn evening, exactly 6 months after he had followed the crying lamb into the forest, Eli stood in the cultural center, carefully arranging a new exhibit that featured both Shoshone artifacts and items from the early settlers. Visitors from both communities came daily now, learning from each other's histories and finding common ground in their shared experiences of survival, loss, and hope on the frontier. As he worked, Eli reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. He was no longer just an orphaned boy scraping by on charity. He had found his purpose in preserving history and fostering understanding between communities. The loneliness that had once consumed him had been replaced by the warmth of belonging to something larger than himself. Through the window, he could see children from both communities playing together in the space between the settlements, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. It was a sound that would have been impossible just months earlier, but now it represented the hope of a generation that might grow up seeing each other as neighbors rather than strangers. The crying of a lamb had led him into the forest that day, but what Eli had truly found was his place in the world, and in doing so, he had helped two communities find their way to each other. In the harsh landscape of the American frontier, where survival often meant putting yourself first, a 13-year-old boy had proven that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to put what's right ahead of what's easy. And in the growing friendship between Cedar Ridge and the Shoshone village, the echo of that lesson would be heard for generations to come.